It began on a night thick with fog, the kind that made streetlights bleed halos into the darkness. I had just moved into my new apartment on the edge of town, a modest two-story building surrounded by narrow alleyways and cracked sidewalks. Everything had seemed normal that evening. The boxes stacked neatly in the living room, the hum of the refrigerator, the muted sounds of traffic outside, until I saw the neighbor. I was unpacking in the living room when movement caught my eye through the sheer curtain of the window opposite my sofa. At first, I thought it was a trick of the fog, a shadow shifting with the dim glow of the street lamp. Then I saw him, or maybe her. The figure was tall, lean, impossibly still, and completely featureless beyond the dim outline of a human form. They were standing just inside their window, curtains drawn only enough for me to see their silhouette, and their face remained completely obscured by the fabric behind the curtain. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. My first thought was that it was one of the other tenants, curious about the new arrival, but then the figure moved. Slowly, almost impossibly slow. The motion was deliberate, measured, as though they were studying me just as intensely as I was studying them. I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something unnatural in the way they lingered, the way their presence seemed to exist solely to watch. I tried to blink it away. Maybe the angle of the light, I thought. Maybe I was seeing things. I turned my attention back to the boxes, but when I looked up again, they were still there, standing at the window, not moving, not blinking, not shifting, just observing. That night, sleep eluded me. Every sound, the distant howl of a dog, the wind rattling the eaves, even the occasional car passing the street, felt amplified, threatening. I found myself glancing at that window every few minutes, half expecting the figure to have disappeared. But no matter how many times I looked, the silhouette remained, a silent, unblinking presence. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it, maybe a trick of the fog, maybe exhaustion, but then my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "You're awake." I dropped the phone. My fingers went numb. The timestamp said it had arrived exactly at midnight. My mind raced. I didn't know anyone in this building. I didn't know anyone in this town. I stared at the window, heart pounding. The figure hadn't moved yet. I considered calling the police, but what would I tell them? That a shadow was watching me through a curtain? That I had received a text from an unknown number saying I was awake? I felt my pulse quicken with rising terror. The figure's stillness was oppressive, suffocating. It wasn't just that they were watching, it was the certainty behind it, the unnerving suggestion that they knew exactly what I was thinking. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes. My eyes burned from staring. The silhouette remained. Occasionally, I thought I saw a faint twitch, the merest shift in posture, as if they were leaning closer just to see me more clearly. And then, just as dawn threatens to bleed light across the horizon, the figure vanished. The window was empty. I didn't sleep that day. I barely ate. Every noise outside, every shadow cast by the rising sun made me flinch. I couldn't stop thinking about that silhouette, and worse, I couldn't stop thinking about the text. How had they known I was awake? How had they seen me? The questions churned endlessly, with no answers. That evening, the fog returned, thicker this time, curling around the building, seeping through the streets like liquid smoke. And at exactly the same time, I saw the figure again, standing in the same window, in the same posture, just as the darkness of the apartment behind them swallowed any details of their face. This time, I couldn't look away. My heart hammered as I forced myself to watch, powerless as they raised a hand, pressing it against the glass, palm flat. I swear I could feel it, the pressure of their gaze crawling over my skin. The text buzzed again. "Don't look away." I screamed quietly, though no sound left my throat. My knees buckled. I dropped to the floor, the boxes around me scattering as I cowered, covering my eyes. But when I dared to peek, even just slightly, the silhouette had disappeared. And so it continued. Glimpses, messages, and the oppressive certainty that someone or something was watching me every hour of every day. By the end of the week, I realized I wasn't safe even in my own apartment. The hallway outside my door sometimes carried soft, deliberate footsteps. Occasionally, I would glance at my neighbor's window and swear I could see that silhouette in the dark, watching even in the middle of the afternoon. The police, when I finally called, dismissed my story as paranoia. "New city, new building, you're stressed," they said. But they hadn't felt it. They hadn't known that weight, the silent, insistent presence that lingered behind the curtain and watched. And then the texts escalated. "You can't hide. I see you. The curtain is thin." The terror became unbearable. I started leaving the lights on, every room bathed in a harsh glow. I locked the doors, triple-checked the windows. I avoided the living room entirely, terrified to glimpse that silhouette again, but it didn't matter. The messages came regardless, always at the exact hour I sat alone, always reminding me of that figure, always reminding me they were waiting. By the 7th night, exhaustion overtook me. I hadn't slept more than a few minutes at a time. I couldn't eat. I couldn't leave the apartment without looking over my shoulder. And I knew, deep in my gut, that the figure hadn't been waiting just in the window. They were watching from everywhere. The hallways, the windows across the street, the shadows that twisted unnaturally just beyond my vision. And soon, I realized the most terrifying part of all. The silhouette wasn't just watching me, they were learning. Every twitch, every step, every reaction I made was noted, memorized, and cataloged. They weren't human, they weren't alive in the way I was, but they existed to observe, to study, to understand. And I knew, before my mind fully accepted it, that the figure would not be satisfied until they had broken me entirely. The following afternoon, the sky hung low with a heavy blanket of ash-gray clouds that made the entire neighborhood seem dim, like someone had turned down the world's brightness. Claire stepped outside with a steaming mug of coffee in hand, partly because she needed the air, and partly because she had barely slept. The image of the figure behind the curtains had replayed in her mind with a cruel persistence. She hadn't even been sure if she'd truly seen a person or if it had been some trick of the night, but the way the curtains had fallen after the shape moved still made her stomach tighten. Standing on her porch, she noticed that the neighboring house's curtains were now drawn tightly shut. Not a sliver of light, not a hint of movement, nothing at all. Claire found herself staring longer than she meant to, waiting to see if the shadow would return. She stared until her coffee cooled in her hands, until her breath made small puffs in the air, though it wasn't cold enough for that. She blinked rapidly, unsure why her breath was visible. The air did not carry the bite required for such a thing. She set her coffee down on the porch railing and stepped onto the lawn, unable to shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt thick, almost weighted, as though the space between her house and the neighboring one was filled with something she couldn't see but could feel pressing faintly against her chest. She took a cautious step forward, then another. Her eyes remained locked on the curtain of the front window. It did not move, it did not flutter. It simply hung, slack and still. But the closer she got to it, the more she realized something deeply unsettling. The fabric was old. Not old in the way curtains usually are, but brittle, faded around the edges and patterned with what looked like faint, uneven stains. Stains that resembled water damage, except they were too dark and gathered mostly near the bottom, as if something had rested against them. Something heavy. She stepped back, unease crawling along her arms like ants. Claire tried to laugh it off, tried to convince herself she was spiraling over nothing. But even as she turned back toward her house, something tugged at the edge of her attention, pulling her gaze over her shoulder and back to the window. The curtain moved. Not much, just an inch or two, a subtle, slow parting, just enough to create a thin, vertical slit of darkness. Claire's breath caught. She froze, every instinct screaming at her to run. A shape appeared behind that gap. At first, it was nothing more than a dark patch, like a shadow trying to decide whether it should take form. Then it sharpened. The outline became clearer. Narrow shoulders, a long neck, and a head tilted slightly to one side, as if observing her from an angle that normal people didn't stand at. Claire couldn't make out its face, couldn't tell if it even had one, but she felt its attention latch onto her like cold fingers brushing the back of her neck. Her chest tightened painfully. She stumbled backward, heart hammering, lungs refusing to expand. She was caught between wanting to scream and wanting to appear normal, as if appearing startled might somehow provoke the figure into doing something. She didn't want to think about what that something could be. The curtain snapped closed. Claire exhaled a trembling breath, not realizing she had been holding it. She didn't dare look away. Not yet. She waited for another twitch of movement, for the curtain to jolt again, for the shadow to appear like a smudge against the fabric, but nothing happened. The window remained still. Claire turned and hurried into her house, slamming the door behind her harder than she intended. The sound echoed through the hallway, startling her enough that she let out a nervous laugh. She pressed her back against the door, trying to regulate her breathing, but the quiet of her own house seemed thicker now, denser, as though silence itself had weight. She slid the deadbolt into place with shaking fingers. Minutes passed, then 10, then 20. She paced her living room until she felt restless, then moved into the kitchen and began washing dishes she had already washed earlier, just for something to do with her hands. The radio played softly on the counter, static-filled, murmuring, like distant voices speaking beneath water. She twisted the knob to change the station, but the static remained. Every channel sounded the same. A low hum, a faint hiss, a rustle like breath pressing up against the microphone. The radio clicked off by itself. Claire froze. The silence afterward was suffocating. She slowly stepped backward until her spine pressed into the edge of the kitchen counter. Her eyes darted over the walls, the ceiling, the floor, as though expecting something to reveal itself. The kitchen clock ticked unnaturally loud. The refrigerator's hum stretched long and deep, almost like a growl. Her own heartbeat sounded like it didn't belong to her body. She swallowed a thick lump in her throat. "I'm not imagining things," she whispered to herself, as if the words alone could ground her sanity. She pulled her phone out of her pocket and opened her recent calls list, her thumb hovering over Megan's name again. But she didn't want to be laughed at, not yet. She didn't want to admit she was spiraling from seeing something through a curtain. Instead, Claire pressed record and lifted her phone toward the window facing the neighbor's house. Today, the curtains opened again. I think someone is watching me. Or something. I don't know. She turned the camera toward herself. Am I losing it? Please tell me I'm not losing it. As she lowered the phone, something caught her eye. A shape passed behind the window of the neighbor's house. Not the slit she'd seen earlier, not a subtle parting of the curtains. This time the shape moved horizontally, crossing from one side of the window to the other, slow and deliberate. Claire's stomach flipped. This figure was taller than before, noticeably. It seemed to stretch upward in a way that wasn't anatomically correct, brushing the top edge of the window frame as if its height changed depending on where it stood. Her phone slipped from her grip and clattered onto the floor. Claire didn't pick it up. Her eyes remained locked on the window. The shape stopped halfway across the frame. It hovered there, its outline visible through the curtain, but warped, elongated in a way that made her vision blur. She wiped her eyes quickly, thinking she was tearing up, but the image didn't change. It was still tall, too tall. The shape leaned closer. The curtain pressed outward slightly, as though something inside the house was pressing its face, or what she assumed was a face, against the fabric to look outward. The pressure on the curtain created a bulge, a slight protrusion, and Claire realized that the only thing separating her from whatever was in that house was one thin pane of glass and a curtain that probably couldn't even hold back dust. She staggered backward, nearly tripping over the chair behind her. That was when her phone vibrated violently on the floor. Claire glanced down at the glowing screen. Unknown number. Her heart plummeted. The phone vibrated again and again and again, rapid, frantic, as though someone on the other end was desperately trying to get her attention. Against her better judgment, she picked it up and answered without speaking. She heard breathing, but not like a normal caller's breath. This breathing was distorted, too loud, too wet, as though whoever or whatever was on the line was pressing their mouth directly against the microphone. The inhale was slow and dragging, as if its lungs were far too large. The exhale rattled, quivering, almost trembling, with a whisper underneath it. The whisper was faint, but Claire felt it run across her skin like cold fingers. Then a voice finally seeped through. Soft, low, wrong. You looked at me. Claire dropped the phone. The window curtains across from her fluttered violently, as though something large had rushed directly against them from behind. And this time, Claire screamed. That night, Claire didn't sleep. Every creak of the building sounded magnified. Every gust of wind scraping the eaves against the walls made her flinch. She had barricaded herself inside her apartment, windows locked, curtains drawn tightly. Yet the sense of being watched hadn't faded. On the contrary, it had grown heavier, like a storm pressing down on her chest. She kept glancing toward the neighbor's window, half expecting the silhouette to reappear, though she knew that no one could be standing there without moving. And yet her gut screamed that it was still watching. By midnight, her apartment had become a prison of shadows. The furniture stretched into unfamiliar shapes, the corners of the rooms blurred into darkness, and every object seemed to whisper a warning if she stared too long. The lamp on the coffee table flickered intermittently, and for a brief second she could swear she saw something standing behind it, a shadow that mimicked the figure she had glimpsed through the curtain. She froze, blinking rapidly, heart pounding. Nothing was there. The lamp steadied, yet the sensation lingered, that unmistakable pressure on her senses that said she was no longer alone. Claire moved through the apartment with careful, deliberate steps, her hands pressed flat against walls and counters, as though grounding herself in reality. Every sound felt like an echo of the silhouette's presence. Then a faint scratching came from the hallway, slow, deliberate, and irregular. She froze, listening, her breath caught. The sound was unmistakably coming from inside her apartment. She grabbed the nearest object, a heavy umbrella, and gripped it tightly, moving toward the hall. The scratching stopped as soon as she stepped into the dim light. Silence settled, but then she noticed it. A shadow flickered across the hallway wall, the exact shape of the silhouette she had seen through the neighbor's window. She spun, her hands shaking violently, scanning the room, but there was nothing there. Only the familiar furniture, the same rug she had unfolded that afternoon. Her phone vibrated sharply in her pocket. Another text. Unknown number. You can't hide. Her pulse raced. She wanted to scream, to throw the phone across the room, but her hands were too stiff. She wanted to run, but every step toward the door felt heavier than the last, as if some invisible weight pressed against her shoulders. Her eyes flicked to the window facing the neighbor. The curtains were slightly parted again, just enough to cast a thin shadow into the room. She didn't dare look closely. Not yet. A whisper came from the dark corner of the room, soft, low, but unmistakably human. Claire. Her body froze, her ears strained. It sounded like her name, yet the timbre was wrong. It wasn't entirely human, and yet it wasn't completely alien either. She could feel the sound vibrating in her bones, crawling into the small spaces inside her chest, making her lungs tighten with a pressure that had nothing to do with air. The shadow at the window shifted. Slowly, deliberately, it moved closer to the glass, as though the creature knew she was watching and wanted to terrify her further. She noticed the curtain's fabric bulge outward slightly, pressing as though against an unseen face, then retreat, then bulge again. The sensation made her skin crawl, every hair standing on end. Claire's phone buzzed again. Another text. "Do you want to see me?" She felt bile rise in her throat. She dropped the phone, but it landed screen up, illuminating the shadow in the window briefly. For an instant, she could see the shape more clearly. A tall, elongated figure, head tilted unnaturally, shoulders thin and impossibly straight. Its movements weren't human. The way it lingered, the way it stretched the space around it was wrong. A sudden gust of wind slammed the windpane, rattling it violently. Claire jumped back, hitting the wall. The shadow vanished. The curtains hung limp, lifeless. And yet she knew it was still there, watching, waiting, learning. She tried to calm herself, tried to rationalize. Maybe it was an intruder. Maybe it was some trick of the lighting. Maybe it wasn't even real. But the texts, the whispers, the impossible shape at the window, none of it could be explained. Not rationally, not safely. Hours passed in tense, breathless silence. Every noise outside, every flicker of light, every shadow that shifted across the room made her flinch. She didn't move from her chair in the corner of the living room, hugging her knees, holding herself still. The storm outside had picked up again. Rain pounded against the window. Wind pressed hard against the walls. Yet she felt safer inside the storm than in the invisible presence across the hall. Then came a knock. Soft, deliberate. Claire's breath caught. She didn't move. She didn't call out. The knocking continued, slow, measured, almost polite in rhythm, but every part of her screamed that no one should be knocking like that in a place she was certain no one could enter. She pressed her back against the wall, trembling. Another whisper, this time from behind her. "You're awake." Her blood ran cold. She whipped around. The apartment was empty. Her phone lay on the floor, screen dark. The shadow at the window was gone. But the whispers persisted. They came from the walls, from the corners, from the very floorboards beneath her. They called her name, mocking, soft and urgent, a chorus of voices layered together. "Claire, Claire, Claire." Claire bolted to the window, yanking the curtain open to confront the neighbor's house. Nothing. Just the fog, the streetlight dim through the mist, and the faint outline of other windows. None of them contained shapes like the one that haunted her dreams, none except at single window. But it was empty now, and she could not see the figure anywhere. Shaking, she turned back inside. That's when she noticed it. The walls themselves seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting subtly like a living thing. Her apartment no longer felt like a safe place. It felt like it had been invaded, like the figure had entered through the very fabric of her walls, and that the curtain was merely its doorway into her world. Claire's phone vibrated again. Unknown number. "Come see me." Tears ran down her face. She sank to the floor, hugging her knees, realizing with horrifying clarity that the silhouette wasn't just watching anymore. It had begun to reach. Not physically, at least, not yet, but into her mind, into her fear, into every small moment of her life. It knew her, or it was learning fast. And every time she looked away, even for a second, it came closer, shaping itself, waiting for her to notice. The whisper came one last time, this time soft, seducing, persuasive. "Don't turn away. I'm right here." And Claire, frozen and terrified, understood that the figure was no longer just a neighbor seen through the curtains. It had become something far more sinister, a predator that existed in the shadows, in the fabric of her life, learning every movement, every thought, every hesitation. And tonight it had begun to step fully into her world.
Claire awoke to cold, not the ordinary kind, the kind that seeped in from a cracked window or poorly insulated walls. This cold felt internal, bone deep, like her blood had thinned overnight. She blinked into the dim morning light, her body stiff from sleeping on the floor. Her phone lay a few feet away, screen black. She didn't remember falling asleep. She didn't remember lying down. She only remembered the whisper, its last words curling around her like smoke. Her apartment was silent now. So silent, in fact, that Claire felt her ears strain for any sound at all. She lifted herself up slowly, every muscle tense,
half expecting to see the silhouette standing in some corner, waiting patiently. But the apartment was empty. The walls had stopped breathing. The shadows were ordinary again. It made her uneasy, like the calm after a predator has eaten and no longer feels the need to stalk. She stood up and moved toward the window. The neighbor's curtains were open, wide open. Her breath hitched. Sunlight, or rather the dull imitation of sunlight, filtered through the thick early morning fog, spilled into the empty room across the way. Claire stepped closer to her own window, squinting hard. Something was off. The room she was looking into didn't look like a normal living room or kitchen. There was no furniture, no lights, nothing hanging from the walls. The wallpaper was peeling, the floorboards had dark stains and long streaks. And the window itself, she gasped, stepping back. The glass was cracked from the inside, spreading out in jagged lines like something had pressed against it with enormous force. She shouldn't look. She knew she shouldn't. But Claire inched forward again, staring harder. The fog on the street was so thick she could barely see the road, but the house across from hers was clear as day. Clearer than it should have been. The fog seemed to avoid it, almost as though the house itself repelled it, carving out a pocket of visibility around its walls. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. And then she noticed something even more disturbing. The house was abandoned, completely. Rotten porch, broken steps, a shattered upstairs window, boards leaning against the siding. There were no signs of life, no curtains in any other windows, no cars, no potted plants, nothing. But the curtain she had seen the silhouette behind, the one that had moved every night, it was the only intact curtain in the entire house. Claire's heart dropped into her stomach. If the house was abandoned, and judging from the state of decay it had been for years, then who the hell had she been seeing? Who had been moving? Who had been pressing themselves against glass that looked old enough to crumble under its own weight? Her throat tightened painfully. She needed answers, and she needed them now. Without giving herself time to reconsider, Claire grabbed her keys, shoved her phone into her pocket, and bolted out the door. The hallway felt unusually dark, but she forced herself forward, out of the building and into the fog-laden morning air. The cold mist clung to her skin. The world felt muffled, muted, like sound moved slower out here. The house across the street towered above her through the haze. She hesitated at the edge of the road. Something deep in her instincts screamed at her to turn around and go back inside, to pretend none of this existed. But another part of her, the part that needed the truth, that needed to understand what was happening to her, forced her to step forward. Her foot touched the cracked walkway. The air changed immediately. It grew thicker, warmer, almost wet, like stepping into a greenhouse after a rain. Her skin prickled. Her vision blurred slightly at the edges. She blinked hard, her breath catching as the house loomed larger and larger. Standing directly before it felt like standing at the mouth of a cave, an ancient waiting thing. Claire pressed her hand against the weathered front door. The door creaked open on its own. The smell hit her first. Dampness, mold, and something metallic lingering faintly in the air. Her pulse quickened. She stepped inside. The interior was worse than she had imagined. Dust blanketed the floor in thick layers. Footprints, fresh ones, cut through it in long trails leading deeper into the house. Her breath grew uneven. She knelt and touched one of the prints. Cold, damp, not human. She stood quickly, stumbling backwards slightly. The air inside felt wrong, as though she'd stepped into a place where time didn't move quite right. The silence was heavy, suffocating. Her footsteps echoed too loudly, bouncing around the darkened halls with a strange resonance. She felt watched. Every second inside this house felt like she entered a stomach rather than a structure, as if the walls were closing in, pulsing faintly. Her throat constricted. She moved faster. The footprints led her down the hallway, past exposed beams and broken picture frames to the living room. There it was, the curtain. The same one she had seen for days. It hung perfectly still, swaying slightly as if disturbed by a breeze that did not exist. The window behind it was cracked almost identically to the one she had seen from outside. Claire approached with trembling hands, every footstep slow, cautious. The curtain's fabric was far more tattered up close than it had been from across the street. She reached out and touched the curtain. It felt warm like skin. She yanked her hand back instinctively, letting out a quiet gasp. The warmth lingered on her fingertips. She pressed her lips together, steeling herself, and then slowly, very slowly, pulled the curtain aside. Her breath left her. She expected to see a wall or an empty room or maybe something hiding behind the glass. Anything but what she actually saw. There was nothing behind the window. Not emptiness, not another room. Nothing. Blackness. A void so deep it felt like looking straight into a mouth. A darkness with depth, with movement, with something swirling within it that her brain refused to comprehend. It was alive, hungry, and as she stared, her vision seemed to bend inward, like she was being pulled to the center of it. She could hear something, faintly at first. Breathing. Wet, rattling breathing. The same sound she had heard through the phone. It grew louder the longer she stared, until it vibrated in her bones. Something shifted in the darkness. Something massive. Something that did not walk so much as slide into place. Claire stumbled backward, her heartbeat slamming wildly in her chest. A voice seeped out from the void, low and distorted. "You came." Her scream tore from her throat, raw and panicked, echoing off the hollow walls of the abandoned house. She turned and ran. Behind her, the curtain fluttered violently. Something was coming through. Claire didn't stop running until she was back in her own apartment, the foggy streets behind her silent, heavy, and impossibly still. Her body ached from exertion, her legs trembling from fear and adrenaline, but she didn't dare rest, not yet. The image of the dark void behind that curtain haunted her every blink. The voice, the distorted whisper that had called her by name, had burned itself into her mind. She couldn't ignore it. She couldn't escape it. She slammed her door shut and locked it, double-checking every lock and bolt. Every window was drawn tightly. The familiar, suffocating silence of her apartment returned, but it was deceptive, a fragile veneer over the horror that had begun to seep into her life. Claire sank to the floor, hugging her knees to her chest, breathing in short, ragged gasps. She could still feel it, the presence, the gaze lingering in the air, coiling like smoke around her shoulders, her arms, her chest. The phone buzzed again, unknown number. Claire's hands shot out, trembling violently, and she pressed the answer button without thinking. "You saw it," the voice whispered, low and slithering, dripping with hunger and amusement. "You can't unsee it." She dropped the phone, pressing it to the floor, and covered her ears with both hands. Her walls seemed to thrum with vibration, every object in the apartment trembling slightly. The air thickened. Shadows pooled along the corners of the room, moving and twisting subtly, never entirely still. And then she saw it. Movement behind her curtains, slight, almost imperceptible. A bulge, a dark form shifting slowly, pressing outward. The same elongated silhouette, impossibly tall, the head tilted, shoulders stiff. Claire's heart seized. It had followed her, across the street, into her apartment. She screamed, stumbling backward, hands clawing at the walls for support. Her eyes were locked on the curtain, half expecting it to explode inward, to reveal that dark, impossible void. But it only pressed against the fabric, steady, deliberate, as though testing, gauging her fear. Claire knew what she had to do. She couldn't let it see her. She had to hide, to survive. She backed into her bedroom, yanking the door closed and bolting it. The walls around her seemed alive, vibrating with a low hum that reverberated through the floorboards. She pressed her back against the door, trembling violently, and tried to steady her breathing. The whispers came again, soft at first, teasing, then louder, insistent, echoing through every corner of the apartment. "Come, come see me." Her pulse was frantic, sweat coated her skin. She realized she was no longer just afraid of what the figure was. She was afraid of what it knew, what it understood about her. It had studied her, learned her patterns, learned her reactions. Every glance, every blink, every hesitant step she had taken was cataloged, stored, used to terrify her. The next movement made her blood run cold. The bedroom window curtains, the ones facing the street, fluttered despite the lack of wind. The silhouette was there, or something like it, moving across her vision just beyond the curtain. She pressed her face to the floor, trying to disappear, wishing she could vanish entirely. Then the whisper came again, directly into her ear this time. "Why do you hide, Claire? Don't you want to see me? Don't you want to know what's real?" The words were soft, persuasive, hypnotic, as if coaxing her to step into the darkness itself. Her mind fought it, screaming, but a small, terrifying part of her wanted to obey. She had seen it, she had experienced it, she had felt the impossibility of that void, the intelligence behind the shadow. She didn't move, she didn't respond. The figure shifted. The curtain stretched, pressing outward like the darkness behind it wanted to escape. The walls vibrated with a low, groaning hum. The room's shadows lengthened unnaturally, creeping towards her like fingers brushing across the floor. The air grew heavier, colder, filled with the metallic scent of old rain and iron. Her stomach twisted. She couldn't breathe. Suddenly, there was silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. The kind that makes your bones ache. The pressure on her chest lifted slightly. Claire's eyes darted toward the window. The silhouette was gone. The curtain hung limp. She dared to exhale. For a moment, she believed she was safe. But then, her phone lit up again. Unknown number. "You can't hide from me. I am everywhere. I am the space between the walls. I am the light behind your eyes. I am the curtain that moves." Claire dropped the phone in horror. She had no energy to scream. Her body shook uncontrollably. She crawled to the farthest corner of the bedroom, curling into herself. The whisper continued, layered, multiple voices now, echoing through every corner of the apartment. "Come see me. Look at me. You know I am here." She pressed her face against her knees, tears streaming down her face. The whisper became a low, guttural laughter vibrating in the very floorboards. The walls seemed to pulse. Every object in the room shuddered as if breathing. The curtain on her bedroom window bulged outward slightly, as though something were reaching towards her, waiting for her to acknowledge it, waiting for her to open her eyes. Claire knew then that there was no escaping it. She could not leave, could not hide, could not survive in ignorance. The figure had followed her, entered her home, learned her patterns, tested her courage, and now it waited for the final step, the one act that would allow it to fully claim her attention, to pull her into its void entirely. Her phone buzzed one last time. Unknown number. She didn't dare look. She didn't dare move. The whisper slithered directly into her mind. "Look at me, Claire, or I will come through." Something behind the curtain shifted, slowly, impossibly human and yet not human. The bulge became a head, shoulders, a face, or the suggestion of a face, blurred, warped, a void that mimicked a human expression but could never truly replicate it. It leaned outward, pressing closer to the glass, closer to her reality. Claire's vision blurred with fear. Her chest ached. Every instinct screamed to run. Every instinct screamed to scream. But she stayed, rooted in terror. And then, for one heart-stopping moment, the figure stopped. Its head tilted, as if studying her, measuring her, and Claire understood with a primal certainty that it had learned. It understood. It would wait, it would watch, it would follow, and it would never stop. The fog outside thickened, the streetlight flickered. The world felt unreal, fragile, and impossibly thin between her and the figure. Claire's apartment was no longer safe. Her home was no longer hers. And through the curtain, the figure remained, always watching, always waiting.